a German officer handed a typed ultimatum across the American lines at Bastogne, and the demand was simple: surrender the town within 2 hours, or a German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions would wipe out every soldier inside. The man who had to answer wasn't even the real commander, Anthony McAuliffe, a career artillery officer, filling in because the actual division commander happened to be in Washington. He read the demand, and he sent back one word, not a paragraph, not a counteroffer, one word, typed in the center of a clean sheet of paper, double-spaced, underlined, with an exclamation point after it. The word was nuts. And here's the thing about that word: it didn't just insult a German general. It made a promise McAuliffe now had to keep. With 14,000 men, guns down to their last few rounds, and the sky too thick to drop a single crate of ammunition, he had 2 hours to say it. He'd need 4 days to make it true. If you find stories like this worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and hit the bell. We have much more coming for you. Your support is what keeps us moving forward. Late in November of 1944, the 101st Airborne Division came off the line in Holland and pulled back into France to rest. The men were spent. Operation Market Garden had chewed through them, and now they sat in camps around Reims, waiting on replacements, waiting on winter coats, waiting on the ammunition that hadn't caught up. This was a division taken apart for a rest. Nobody was refitting it for a battle. Then, on the 16th of December, 3 German armies came through the Ardennes. The attack landed on the thinnest, quietest stretch of the American front, a rest area held by tired men and green replacement units. It tore a hole in the line. Within 2 days, the whole map in that sector had gone soft, and one town sat right in the path of it: Bastogne, not much of a place on its own, a market town up in the Belgian hills. What mattered was underneath it: 7 paved roads and a rail line all met there. In country like the Ardennes, thick with forest and cut up by river valleys, an army moves on the roads, or it barely moves at all. The Germans knew it. They called Bastogne a road octopus. Take the town, and the arms of the whole road network were yours. Leave it in your rear, still held by the enemy, and every one of those roads turned into a problem. So Eisenhower's headquarters reached for the reserve. 2 airborne divisions were sitting in France, and the 101st was one of them. Hold Bastogne. The order came down. Hold it at all costs. Now, here's where a small thing decides a large one. The man who should have led that division into Bastogne was Major General Maxwell Taylor. He wasn't there. Taylor had been called back to the United States for a staff conference, half a world away when the offensive broke. The Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, was away too, over in England. So command of the 101st, at the exact moment it was ordered into the most important crossroads on the Western Front, fell to the man next in line. That man was Anthony McAuliffe, and McAuliffe was not an infantry commander. He was the division's artillery officer. Think about that for a second. The Screaming Eagles were about to fight the defining infantry battle of their war, surrounded on foot against tanks, and the officer holding the whole thing together was a gunner, a career artilleryman, West Point class of 1918, a man who jumped into Normandy and ridden a glider into Holland, but whose trade was howitzers and fire missions, not the desperate business of holding a shrinking ring of foxholes. We often picture high command as something planned, handed to the right specialist at the right hour. The reality at Bastogne was an accident of the calendar. A conference in Washington and a trip to England put a gunner in the chair, and the fate of a road hub that could shape the entire German offensive rode on it. McAuliffe didn't get a slow entrance either. He got word of the breakthrough on the 16th, and by the 17th, he was organizing the division to move. The first plan sent them to a town called Werbermont, up on the northern shoulder. Then it changed. The other airborne division, the 82nd, could get moving sooner, so it took Werbermont to block a German armored column driving in from the north. The 101st was rerouted to Bastogne instead, better than 100 miles off, up on a plateau over 1,400 feet high. On the morning of the 18th, the division hit the road. Around 14,000 men in some 380 trucks. grinding south and east toward a fight nobody had packed for. And that's the part that turns a hard job into a trap. These men were rolling toward a siege without the things a siege demands: short on ammunition, short on food, short, badly, on winter clothing, in one of the coldest Decembers the region had seen, up on an exposed plateau where the wind had nothing to stop it. Some of them had no overcoats, some had no overshoes. They were going to sit in frozen holes in the ground and be shelled for a week. At the town, McAuliffe got his orders straight from the Corps commander, General Troy Middleton of the 8th Corps. Hold Bastogne. The 101st had almost no armor of its own, so a hard-driving anti-tank unit, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, was pulled out of reserve 60 miles to the north and sent racing down to join them. It arrived late on the 19th. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division came in as well. It wasn't enough to match what was coming, because what was coming was the spearhead of an entire Panzer army, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, and out in front of it, the 47th Panzer Corps under General Heinrich von Luttwitz, 3 divisions of it, the Panzer Lehr, the 2nd Panzer, and the 26th Volksgrenadier, tanks, assault guns, and fresh infantry, all of it funneling towards 7 roads that all ran through one town. The 101st didn't hold that town by sitting inside it. In the first days, they fought out on the approaches, on the roads leading in, north of Bastogne, at a village called Noville. A small tank infantry team from the 10th Armored and a battalion of paratroopers took on part of the 2nd Panzer Division head-on. A handful of tank destroyers and some very stubborn infantry did so much damage that the German commander became convinced he was facing a far larger force, and he pulled up short. That mistake cost the Germans hours, and hours were everything. Those outlying fights, expensive as they were, bought McAuliffe the time he needed to organize a real defense before the ring closed. Then it closed. By the 20th and the 21st, the outer positions were being pushed back, tighter and tighter toward the town itself. The roads out were being cut one at a time, and inside that ring sat McAuliffe, an artillery officer by trade, with a worn-down division, a few borrowed tanks, guns he couldn't keep fed, and men freezing in the open. That was the cage, 2 ways out of it, and both were bad. Try to hold with too little of everything, and get ground down over days, or give the town up. Nobody in Bastogne was talking about that second door yet. In 3 days, the Germans would put it in writing, walk it through the line under a white flag, and force McAuliffe to choose. At about 11:30 on the morning of the 22nd of December, 4 figures came walking up the Arlen Road from the direction of Remoyfosse, south of the town. 2 of them carried white flags, 2 officers, 2 enlisted men. The senior was a Major Wagner on the staff of the 47th Panzer Corps. The junior officer, a lieutenant named Helmuth Henke from the operations section of the Panzer Lehr Division, walked with a briefcase tucked under his arm. The 2 enlisted men had been pulled from the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. They came up the road slowly, in the open, in plain view of the American positions. The men watching them come were from F Company of the 327th Glider Infantry, holding that stretch of the perimeter. 2 sergeants on that line, Oswald Butler and Carl Dickinson, caught sight of the 4 of them first, coming up out of the low ground with their flags. For a moment, nobody knew what to do with it. You do not often see the enemy stroll toward your rifle in broad daylight. The Germans walked right past a bazooka team dug in near a farm, kept walking, and stopped in front of a foxhole held by a private, first class, named Leo Palmer, a man on a Browning automatic rifle. Palmer looked up at them. Long overcoats, shiny black boots, officers, clearly, and they didn't look like men who'd come to surrender. Henke spoke English, and he used it. He wanted to see the officer in charge of this section. Palmer, a rifleman in a hole in the snow suddenly being addressed in English by a German lieutenant, didn't have an answer for that. A staff sergeant nearby, Carl Dickinson, stepped out onto the road and waved the group over to him. Another man came up too, a medic named Ernest Premetz, who could speak German, in case somebody needed to translate. Nobody did. Henke had announced it himself. In plain English, we are parlementaires, negotiators, men carrying a message under a flag of truce, and that message needed to reach the American commander in Bastogne. The Germans had come prepared for exactly this. They'd brought their own blindfolds. Henke tied one over Wagner's eyes, and Dickinson tied one over Henke's. and the two enlisted men were left standing where they were. Dickinson and Premetz walked the two blindfolded German officers back off the road to a nearby farmhouse, the Kessler place, and from there the thing started climbing the chain of command. Now, word of this travels fast, and it travels wrong. Up and down the American line, a rumor started moving. The Germans out there were giving up. Somebody had come forward under a white flag, and the men freezing in their holes let themselves believe for a few minutes that the enemy had finally had enough. You can understand why they wanted it to be true. They were surrounded, low on everything, and here came Germans waving white. But the rumor had it exactly backwards. The white flag didn't mean the Germans were quitting. It meant they expected the Americans to. What Wagner had in that briefcase was an ultimatum, and it was a strange document. It had been typed out on 2 sheets of paper, one copy in English and one in German. Both had been typed on an English typewriter, which you could tell because the accent marks the German text needed had been added in afterward, by hand, in ink. Somebody in a German headquarters had sat down at the wrong machine and penned in the marks one at a time. A small detail, and it tells you how fast this whole thing had been thrown together. The words were formal, almost courtly, and underneath the courtesy sat a threat. The fortune of war, the message said, was changing. The American forces in and around Bastogne had been encircled by strong German armored units. There was, the document went on, only one way to save those encircled troops from total annihilation, and that was the honorable surrender of the town. Then came the specifics, and the specifics were the pressure. If the Americans refused, the note said, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions stood ready to wipe out the troops in and near Bastogne. The order to open fire would be given the moment a 2-hour deadline ran out, and then the coldest line in the whole thing. Any serious losses among the town's civilians, the note said, from the shelling to come, would not match the well-known American humanity. Read that again. The Germans were telling the American commander that if he refused to surrender, the artillery would come down on the town, and if Belgian civilians died under it, the blame would be his for having the poor taste to keep fighting. The threat and the guilt trip folded together into one polite paragraph and signed simply the German commander. That commander was General Heinrich von Leutwitz, running the 47th Panzer Corps. It was his idea. He'd had his staff draw the ultimatum up and send it forward. Here's a thing worth holding on to, though, because it matters later. Not everyone on the German side thought this was a good idea. Manteuffel, the army commander above Leutwitz, said flatly after the war that he had not ordered any note of this kind written or sent, and the 2 German generals closest to the actual fighting around Bastogne, Bayerlein of the Panzer Lehr and Kokot of the 26th Volksgrenadier, both figured the surrender demand would go nowhere. They expected to be told no. They were already planning to take the town the hard way. That was the German side's private doubt. On the American side, all that had arrived was the document and the clock attached to it. The 2 German officers waited out in the cold, blindfolded, in the woods beside a foxhole command post, with F Company men standing guard over them. And that 2-hour clock was already running. Every minute the note spent climbing the chain of command was a minute gone from the deadline, which meant that by the time it reached the man who had to answer it, part of his window to answer had already burned away. At the regimental headquarters, the commander of the 327th, Colonel Bud Harper, was out inspecting his line and wasn't there to take it. The senior man present was the operations officer, Major Alvin Jones. Jones got on the phone to Division, and Division told him to go get the message and bring it in. So Jones drove out to the F Company command post, took the 2 typed sheets in hand, and carried them toward Bastogne, toward the headquarters where an artillery officer was about to be handed a piece of paper that gave him 2 hours to give up. The message reached the division command post in Bastogne, an old stone barracks called the Heinz that served as the division's main command post through the siege, while the man it was addressed to was asleep. McAuliffe had been grabbing rest where he could, and when the German notes started climbing the chain, he was down in his quarters next to the communication center, out cold. It fell to the acting chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, to go wake him. Moore leaned in and gave him the plain version. The Germans, he said, had sent some people forward to take their surrender. And here's the very first thing McAuliffe ever said about the most famous surrender demand of the war. Half asleep, not even out of his sleeping bag yet, he said one word: nuts. Then he started climbing to his feet. He didn't mean it as a reply. Nobody had asked him to compose anything. It was just the sound a tired man makes when he gets shaken awake and told the enemy wants him to quit. Moore heard it, walked back out to the communication center, and passed the situation along to the rest of the staff. McAuliffe's one-word reaction included. When Major Jones arrived with the 2 typed sheets, the staff read them over before carrying them in, and by the time McAuliffe had the paper in his own hands, there was a small confusion to clear up. He'd caught only that a German party had come in under a flag of truce, and his first read of it was the hopeful one. "They want to surrender?" he asked. "No, sir," came the answer from his operations officer. "They want us to surrender." McAuliffe laughed. He read the thing through, this formal little threat with its 2-hour clock and its courtly menace, and his verdict was the same word as before, with a bit more behind it. Us surrender, or nuts. And he let the message fall to the floor. Then he did something that tells you exactly how much weight he gave the ultimatum. He left. He walked out of the command post and headed for the western edge of the perimeter, because a unit out there had knocked out a German roadblock that morning, and he wanted to go tell them they'd done well. A surrender demand with a deadline ticking on it was lying on his floor, and the commander's response was to go congratulate his troops for fighting. As far as McAuliffe was concerned, according to the account left by the Army historian Sidney Marshall, his men were giving the Germans a real beating and could keep right on holding. The note didn't rate a second thought. While McAuliffe was out on the perimeter shaking hands with his roadblock crew, the 2 German officers were still standing blindfolded in the cold by that forward command post, waiting, and their own clock was running against them. They had come in demanding an answer inside 2 hours, and now the American commander they had come to intimidate had wandered off to praise his men for a good morning's work. The delegation that was supposed to be applying the pressure was, at that moment, the party doing the waiting. Now, about that word. It's worth stopping on because of who said it. McAuliffe was not a swearer. His own aide, Captain Vincent Vicari, said he was the only general he ever served under who didn't use profane language, and that nuts was simply part of how the man normally talked. That's the small human accident sitting right at the center of this whole thing. A more foul-mouthed commander would have answered that ultimatum with something unprintable, something that could never have been read out on the radio or run in a newspaper back home. Because McAuliffe's strongest word was a mild one, the reply lived. It could be repeated in front of anybody. History got to keep it precisely because the man who said it was too clean-spoken to say anything worse. There was still a problem, though. The Germans were out there blindfolded, waiting on a formal answer. When word came back that the enemy officers wanted something in writing, McAuliffe returned to the command post and found himself stuck. He wanted to reply. He just didn't know what to put down. "Well," he told the staff, "I don't know what to tell them." And they had already been chewing on it. The officers in that command post had been trying to find the right formal language for an official military reply, the kind of measured diplomatic phrasing you send back to an enemy commander, and they were getting nowhere. Everything sounded too stiff or too soft or just plain beside the point, when the answer in every head in the room was a flat no. It was Kinnard who cut through it. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the operations officer, spoke up and said that whatever McAuliffe decided on, his first shot at it would be tough to beat. McAuliffe didn't follow. "What do you mean?" he asked, and Kinnard reminded him. "Sir, you said nuts." The room caught on at once. The whole staff liked it. It was blunt, it was pure McAuliffe, and it said no in a way no translator could ever soften into something diplomatic. McAuliffe wrote the word down on a message pad and told them to have it typed up. None of the men in that room, McAuliffe included, had the faintest idea the word would outlast the war and trail the general around for the rest of his life, and they typed it up with a certain amount of ceremony. On a full clean sheet of paper, everything centered. They put the date at the top, then the line to the German commander, then the reply itself, then the signature, the American commander. The reply in the middle was that single word. When the Associated Press correspondent Fred Ball later got hold of the story, he noted the exact look of it on the page. The word set off in double spacing, underlined and capped with an exclamation point. 4 short lines on a sheet of paper, and the one that mattered had 1 syllable. Somebody had to run it back out to the Germans, and Colonel Bud Harper, commander of the 327th, the outfit holding that piece of the line, volunteered on the spot. He'd take it out himself, he said. It would be a real pleasure. Harper drove out to where the 2 German officers were still standing blindfolded under guard. He had the reply in his hand. The senior of the two, still unable to see a thing, asked whether the answer was written or spoken. Harper put the paper into his hand. And here's where the trouble with a one-word reply shows up, because nuts was going to mean absolutely nothing to a German officer. They read it and they were confused. Was this a yes or a no? Harper set them straight. It was, he told them, definitely not a yes. That same word would later have to be explained all over again to the other Allied armies, none of whom had any notion what an American meant by it. A few more words passed between them, and the German officers saluted, correct and formal to the end. Then, as the two Germans turned to be led away, Harper gave them the plain version of the sentiment to carry home. If they didn't understand nuts, he said, they could go back and tell their commanding general to go to hell. Then the two officers were walked back toward their own lines, carrying the reply and the insult both, pointed back the way they'd come toward the men who had sent them. Back at their car, the two German officers put their belts back on and got ready to drive home with the answer. There's a small, telling moment here, kept alive in the account Henke wrote down afterward. As they sorted out their gear, Major Wagner took the pistol he'd been carrying loose in his trouser pocket and slid it into its holster, saying he had no intention of getting caught out there without it. They had come in under a flag of truce and they were leaving under one. And even so, the senior man wanted his sidearm where his hand could find it. That was the mood on the 22nd of December. Nobody trusted the quiet. They drove first to the headquarters of the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment in a village called Lutrebois, reported in, and then pushed on another mile or so south toward the headquarters of the Panzer Lehr Division. And on the way, they nearly rolled right past a piece of this that makes the whole thing sharper. Parked by a stand of trees near the road was the staff car of General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army. Wagner stopped, got out, and reported to him. Remember who Manteuffel is. This is the army commander who, after the war, stated flatly that he had never ordered a surrender note of that kind written or sent. The ultimatum had gone out below him on the initiative of his corps commander. And now, on a cold roadside, the officer who had carried that note into Bastogne was reporting back that the Americans had said no. The demand nobody at the top had authorized had just been handed back rejected. From there, the two officers drove onto the Panzer Lehr command post, and waiting there, as it happened, was the man whose idea the whole thing had been in the first place, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, the corps commander. Standing with him was General Fritz Bayerlein, who ran the Panzer Lehr. The two officers presented the American reply, the single typed word, nuts. Now watch what happens in that room, because this is where the ultimatum comes apart in the hands of the men who sent it. Bayerlein heard that the answer was no, and his response was immediate. Fine. If the Americans wanted to be stubborn about it, then it was time to open up with the heavy artillery sitting behind the hill and start making the threat in the note real. That, after all, was the entire point of the ultimatum. Surrender, or the guns take the town apart. Luttwitz cut him off. The heavy artillery, Luttwitz told him, was not behind the hill anymore. It had been moved, pushed forward, past Bastogne, out to positions further west. The great weight of guns the note had promised, the artillery corps that was supposed to open fire the instant the 2-hour deadline ran out, was not in place to do any such thing. It had already been sent somewhere else. Sit with that for a second. The ultimatum McAuliffe had been handed threatened him with 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions, standing ready to wipe out his men the moment he refused. And back at the German headquarters, when one of their own generals said, "Let's fire those guns," the corps commander had to tell him the guns were not there. The threat had teeth on paper and nothing behind it on the ground. Bayerlein wasn't done. He started working the problem out loud, laying out how he might go at Bastogne anyway, without the heavy guns. And Luttwitz cut him off a second time. Bastogne, Luttwitz reminded him, was not Bayerlein's objective in the first place. The Panzer Lehr's job was to keep rolling west, around the town, on toward Rochefort. Bastogne was to be left to the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. So not only were the promised guns gone, the division standing in that command post was not even supposed to be the one that took the place. This is the part worth pulling out and holding up to the light. The surrender demand at Bastogne, the one that produced the most famous one-word reply in American military history, was a bluff, not a completely hollow one. The German forces ringing Bastogne were real and dangerous, but the specific, thundering threat written into that note, the artillery corps that would wipe out the garrison inside a 2-hour window could not have been carried out the way it was written. The guns had been moved before the note was ever delivered. WWII had sent a demand backed by firepower he had already ordered somewhere else. And here's the thing that makes it worse for the men who sent it. They already suspected it wouldn't work. Bailén and Cocotte, the general whose infantry division was actually going to have to take Bastogne, had both figured from the start that the Americans would refuse. Word of the plan had filtered down to Cocotte's division that same morning. Corps had told them a negotiator from the Panzer Lehr would go forward and ask the Bastogne garrison to give up. So the surrender bid was no secret to the men who would have to storm the town if it failed. Cocotte's own account has the news of the answer reaching him almost as an afterthought. The Corps had sent a negotiator forward, and word came back that the enemy commander had turned the surrender down with, in Cocotte's own words, remarkable brevity. To Cocotte it fit. It matched the stubbornness the defenders had shown him all along. Nobody on the German side who was close to the actual fighting was surprised by the word nuts. They were only surprised maybe by how short it was. So put the whole thing together, the way it stood in that command post on the afternoon of the 22nd. A note nobody at the army level had authorized. A threat the Corps couldn't actually deliver because its own guns had been sent west. A division being told the town was never its target to begin with, and a one-word answer from an American gunner that the Germans couldn't quite translate, lying on the table in the middle of all of it. The sting in that reply wasn't only that McAuliffe had said no, it was that he had said no to a demand the German command couldn't back up. And then the German command spent the next few minutes in its own headquarters finding out loud exactly how little was standing behind the words they'd sent him. Whatever happened to Bastogne next was going to have to be done the hard way, without the promised guns, by a division that had just been told to be somewhere else, and against 14,000 Americans whose commander had answered a demand for surrender with a single syllable and meant it. For the men in the foxholes, saying no to the Germans didn't put a single round back in the guns. That's the thing to hold onto about the reply. It was defiant, it was famous, it lifted spirits up and down the line. It also changed nothing about the hard arithmetic of the siege. The 101st was still surrounded, still short of ammunition, still freezing on an open plateau, and now formally on record, telling a stronger enemy to go to hell. The word had to be backed up, and backing it up would take 4 more days of fighting. The first break came from the sky. For days, the weather had been the Germans' ally, low grey cloud that grounded the Allied air forces and kept supplies from reaching the town. An airdrop plan for the 22nd never arrived. The skies were too thick, and all the 3rd Army's air people could send was a message that the situation of the 101st was known and appreciated. Known and appreciated. That's cold comfort to a gunner rationing his last few shells. Then, on the 23rd, the sky cleared. And when it cleared, it filled. Wave after wave of C-47 transport planes came over Bastogne, and out of them dropped hundreds of parachutes, each one colored to mark what it carried. In that first big resupply, something like 241 transports put roughly 144 tons of supplies into an area barely half a mile square, packed into well over 1,000 containers. The drops were so accurate, the men on the ground recovered almost all of it. Ammunition, rations, medicine, falling out of a clear, cold sky into the hands of troops who had been down to nothing. And down to nothing is not an exaggeration. One artilleryman remembered the state of the guns around him in those days. Some had no ammunition left at all. Others were down to 1 or 2 rounds apiece. 1 or 2 rounds. The Germans, he noted, didn't know that. The whole defense of Bastogne was in places being propped up by a bluff of its own. Batteries that looked deadly and were nearly empty. And the men behind them knew exactly how thin the margin was. On Christmas Eve, McAuliffe did 2 things worth remembering. The first was a message to his troops. He put out a Christmas communique, and in it, he did something unusual for a commander in that spot. He told his men the whole story. He printed the German surrender demand in full and printed his own one-word answer right underneath it. "What's merry about all this?" he asked them. "When it's cold and you're fighting and you aren't home." And then he answered his own question. The division had stopped cold everything the enemy had thrown at it, from every direction on the compass. That, he told them, was their worthy Christmas present to their country and the people they'd left at home. He wanted the men in those holes to know exactly what they were holding and why. The second thing was private, and it was heavier. That night, McAuliffe got on the radio to General Middleton, the Corps commander outside the ring, and for a moment, the Defiance dropped away. The finest Christmas present the division could get, McAuliffe told him, would be a relief tomorrow. Middleton's answer came back just as quiet. "I know, boy," he said. "I know." Out on the line that same evening, some of the officers noticed a strange, detached mood settling over the men. As the last light went on Christmas Eve, paratroopers climbed up out of their holes and shook hands with one another, quietly, the way men do when they aren't sure they'll get the chance again. Tomorrow did not bring relief. Tomorrow brought the heaviest attack of the siege. On Christmas Day, the German commander Kokot threw everything he could scrape together at the western edge of the perimeter. Artillery pounded the town, and then a column of 18 tanks, carrying a battalion of infantry on their decks, came driving in toward the villages of Sham and Himrul, where the 327th Glider Infantry held the line. The tanks hit hard. They punched clean through the forward positions and rolled all the way to a battalion command post at Himrula. For a few minutes that morning, it looked like the ring might finally break inward. It didn't. The glider men held their original ground even with tanks in behind them, turned around and fought. The German armor that had broken through split into two columns, and both ran straight into a crossfire from every direction. 4 tank destroyers of the 705th, 2 companies of paratroopers from the 502nd, artillerymen firing over open sights, and bazooka teams working the flanks. One column tried to swing around and take champs from the rear, and it was taken apart. The paratroopers stripped the infantry off the tank decks, and then the tanks were knocked out one at a time. Of the 18 that started the Christmas morning assault, not one survived the day. The 327th took its ground back and captured most of 100 German infantry in the bargain. This is where you see what the word actually cost and who paid it. McAuliffe said nuts in a warm command post in about a second and a half. Making that word stand up took paratroopers and glider infantry and gun crews standing in the snow on Christmas morning, some of them fighting as riflemen because their howitzers had run dry, taking on tanks at close range with whatever they could still fire. The reply belonged to McAuliffe. The bill for it got paid out on the perimeter by men whose names never made the headline. Then, the day after Christmas, relief finally came up from the south, and it came fast. It was Patton's 3rd Army that broke through, and specifically the 4th Armored Division, which had made one of the great forced marches of the war to get there, better than 150 miles in around 19 hours, wheeling up from the Lorraine front to the flank of the Bulge. By the afternoon of the 26th, one of its combat commands had fought to within a few miles of the town and stalled against German positions along the road. So Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, running the lead tank battalion, decided to quit grinding and gamble instead. He would punch a small column straight up the road through the village of Assenois and try to burst into Bastogne before the Germans could close it off. The lead tank was a heavy Sherman assault tank named Cobra King, under a lieutenant named Charles Boggess. A little after 4 in the afternoon, Boggess opened fire and drove 5 tanks and a single half-track running the gauntlet through Assenois, with every gun going. Around 10 minutes to 5, Boggess reached a line of foxholes at the edge of the perimeter and saw engineers in American uniforms waiting there, men of the 326th Airborne Engineers. The corridor was open. A short while later, Colonel Abrams came up and shook hands with McAuliffe, who had walked out to the line to meet the men breaking through to him. The siege was not over. The corridor was narrow, and the fighting around Bastogne would grind on for weeks yet, but the ring had been cracked. The town had held, and the word McAuliffe sent out on the 22nd, the one-syllable refusal the Germans couldn't translate and couldn't back up, had been made true the only way it ever could be, by 4 days of men in frozen holes who would not be moved. Go back to the 2 sheets of paper the Germans carried in. One was typed in English, one in German. Both run through the same English typewriter, with the accent marks the German page needed, penned in afterward by hand, 1 stroke at a time. That was the document. It wasn't much to look at, for a thing that demanded a whole division lay down its arms, a formal, careful, courtly demand. promising a garrison total destruction inside 2 hours if it didn't give up. McAuliffe answered the whole of it with one word, 4 short lines on a clean page, the middle line underlined and capped with an exclamation point. He had 2 hours to write it. It took his men until the day after Christmas to finish backing it up. Here's the human thing underneath all of it, and it's smaller and stranger than the legend. Saying no is easy. McAuliffe didn't agonize over that reply. He said it half asleep, out of pure reflex, before he had even read the paper. And then he wandered off to go congratulate some troops. The word cost him almost nothing. What it cost got paid by other people over 4 days, in the snow, on a perimeter, against tanks, some of them fighting with empty guns and their bare nerve. A man can refuse in a second. Whether the refusal means anything is settled later by whoever has to stand behind it. McAuliffe got the credit and the nickname, and a lifetime of being introduced as the man who said it. The men who made it true mostly got a foxhole. They came out of Bastogne with a name they'd earned the hard way, the battered defenders who would not quit, and that name belonged to every man on the perimeter. McAuliffe, for his part, spent a good deal of the rest of his life a little tired of the word, tired of being introduced at dinner after dinner as the general who told the Germans no. There was, after all, a great deal more to what happened at Bastogne than one syllable, and most of it happened out where he wasn't standing. And the last thing is the coldest. That thundering threat in the note, the German artillery corps and the 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions, the guns that were supposed to open fire the instant the 2-hour deadline ran out and wiped the town off the map, never fired. They couldn't. The heavy guns had already been ordered west, past Bastogne and out of range, before the note was ever handed across the line. The bombardment the whole ultimatum was built on, the one designed to make an American general fold, did not come. Not in 2 hours. Not at all. The most famous surrender demand of the war was answered with a single word, and the punishment it promised for that word was one the men who wrote it had already made impossible to deliver.